Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome to this humanitarian talk entitled Let's Not Abandon Children Affected by Armed Conflicts, Addressing the Drivers and Consequences of Child Recruitment and Use. Thank you to all of you for joining. Just to recall that this is an event, a humanitarian talk that is being held in the context of the European Humanitarian Forum, and we very much welcome the fact that this is being discussed also within this context. By way of introduction, my name is Joanna Darmanin. I am the head of unit in DG ECHO, responsible for policies including children and also this issue of children in armed conflict. So I'm very happy to be here with you today. And I would like to first of all thank the organizers for taking the initiative. Save the Children, the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict, World Vision, and also UNICEF. This humanitarian talk will discuss the scale of child recruitment and use and discuss what its potential impacts are in terms of peace and security and how to end and prevent this phenomenon. Today, more children live in conflict zones than in 2019. Imagine how this has gone up also with the Ukraine conflict, which has prevailed in our discussions also in the Humanitarian Forum. Despite progress in some areas to protect conflict-affected children, the trend is that a higher number of children are at risk of grave violations in conflict zones, such as recruitment and use by parties to conflict. Children can be recruited in a number of ways. Some recruitments are through abduction, while others are compelled or coerced into joining armed forces or armed groups due to a range of interrelated factors. Poverty, experiencing violence, neglect within families and communities, a lack of educational opportunities are just a few of the drivers. The recruitment and use of children has significant impacts and consequences for both families and communities. 2022 marks the 15th anniversary of the Paris Principles and Commitments that have been endorsed by 112 states to this date. This session will also examine the measures that can be put in place to not only end this phenomenon, but also to work more to prevent it. If I may just introduce a little bit the run of the show for this afternoon session. So we will first have three panelists, distinguished panelists who will give us their points of view. We will then have a segment from interventions from the floor, and also there will be time at the end for questions. So please do not hesitate to post your questions on Slido so that we can pose this to the panelists. So with those introductory remarks, perhaps I can kick off the session, and I'm very happy to introduce our first distinguished speaker of the panel, Ms. Virginia Gamba, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Children and Armed Conflict. Ms. Gamba, this year has been an important year, and in January you published a study on the 25th anniversary of the mandate. Perhaps you can tell us what are the main findings on child recruitment and use, and how does this issue relate to the humanitarian, development and peace nexus? It would be particularly interesting to also understand what is the role of regional organizations in particular, for example, the European Union, in ending and working to prevent this phenomenon. Ms. Gamba, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Joanna. It's such a pleasure to be with all of you in this humanitarian talk as part of the European Humanitarian Forum. And I'm delighted to be here with UNICEF, Save the Children, World Vision, and you, Joanna. Yes, you're right. This year marks the 25th anniversary of my mandate. And as a result, we published this study that you mentioned, which was a really interesting experience. It did identify quantifiable progress, but it also identified gaps that needs to be filled. So I think on the progress side, we could see that 172 members have ratified the optional protocol to the Convention on the Rights of the Child on the involvement of children in armed conflict. This is terribly important. The issue of children and armed conflict has been firmly placed in the international peace and security agenda, which not mean-fit. There are 13 Security Council resolutions attesting to that effect, and at least 170,000 children have been released from armed groups and have been so far reintegrated. We also, the CAC mandate is about engagement. It's not just about identifying the problem, it's about doing something about it. So there have been 37 action plans that have been developed between the UN and parties to conflict, and 26 of those 37 are specifically about addressing the recruitment and use of children. We also have seen in the last 25 years, through a lot of push and pull from our partners, ourselves, that many countries have decided to criminalize child recruitment and use, have endorsed very useful documents such as the Paris Principles and Commitments, which I consider best practices, and other instruments such as the Vancouver Principles, to only name a few achievements, and also the Safe Schools Declaration, I think is very important. So the successes, however, like I said before, should not make us forget the reality. The same study showed that more than a third of all UN-verified grave violations since 2005 have involved the recruitment and use of children. This corresponds to about 93,000 children taking part in hostilities, including in fighting roles. Boys are at a higher risk of recruitment and use, and consequently at a higher risk of being killed or maimed. Their susceptibility to recruitment and use in some contexts is due, for example, to the fact that they're socialized as providers and defenders of clans and tribes, and hence often perceived as adults even before they turn 18. While boys are really more visible victims of recruitment and use, girls are equally at risk and used in multiple functions, including as cleaners, sex slaves, or child brides. We're concerned that in the Lake Chad region, this seems to be increasing the number of girls that are recruited and used or abducted for the purposes of recruitment and use. Throughout the years, new conflict dynamics and operational tactics have posed new challenges for the protection of children. And I think here we have to talk about cross-border recruitment, which is on the rise due to the movement of rebel groups across borders. And also we have a problem with the counter-terrorism frameworks that have severely impacted conflict-affected children. Children have, for example, been increasingly arrested and detained for their alleged or actual association with armed groups, including those designated as terrorist groups by the UN. And therefore, this has exposed them to further violations, such as torture or sexual violence. Additionally, over the last 2 years, the COVID-19 pandemic has further increased vulnerabilities in war zones. There are closed schools, limited protection networks, and disintegrating economies, all of which generate a push factor that favor, amongst others, recruitment and use of children. As relates to your questions on regional organization, let me answer that briefly. Regional organizations such as the European Union are central to the development, humanitarian, and peace-building actors, and thus they have a crucial role to play in ending and preventing child recruitment and use. Regional early warning systems to detect trends in grave violations can be used as indicators of wider trends in insecurity and the emergence of conflict. For example, spikes in the recruitment and use of children may point towards a deteriorating security situation and possibly tactical and strategic military preparations by parties to conflict. The integration of specific provisions on recruitment and use of children into crisis management and stabilization tools used by regional organizations, such as particularly capacity building for security sector reform and judicial reform, has a very important role to play in ending and preventing grave violations, particularly of those related to recruitment and use. In addition, financial support by regional organizations to long-term, age and gender-sensitive, community-led reintegration efforts for children released from armed forces and groups into the society is absolutely crucial to avoid recruitment. In that regard, I encourage proactive interventions across the humanitarian development peace nexus that mitigate the drivers of conflict, reduce the risk, and strengthen the resilience of individuals and societies. To quickly conclude, whether it's regional organizations, the United Nations, civil society, member states, even communities at peace or in conflict, we all have a role to play, including the children themselves through their voices, in stopping the use and abuse of children by and for armed conflict, and in making sure that children affected by wars around the world are not forgotten and their aspirations are translated into working realities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Gamba, for highlighting both the successes but also the challenges. For example, cross-border recruitment, counterterrorism impact, and also for your suggestions to the EU to include integration in crisis management, capacity building, and also the need for enhanced financial support. So thank you very much for that. Let me now introduce Mr. Innocent Oponya. Mr. Oponya, are you with us? Yes, I can see you. Mr. Oponya was born in Gulu in northern Uganda and currently resides in Germany with his wife and 8-month-old daughter. He is a former child soldier and now a social worker, currently working as a trainee program officer with World Vision Germany. You are also, from what I understand, a full-time child rights advocate. Tell us, Mr. Oponya, can you give us a little bit of your experience, how girls and boys are differently impacted by recruitment and use? And again, what are your recommendations that you can share in order to help us prevent child recruitment? Mr. Oponya, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much for welcoming me over. My name, as they said, is Innocent Oponya, and I was born in Gulu in the middle of an ongoing war. I came face to face with the reality of the war at the age of 10, where I was abducted as a child soldier and was taken to South Sudan. And you know, it was a system that kept happening for so long. For so many years, children were taken from their families, separated from their parents, and sent to fight a war they never understood. A war that up to now, if you ask me, I will tell you, I don't know why I fought it, but I had to fight it. A war that changed my life and changed how I look at the world. I thought I was so young at the age of 10 holding a gun, but then I found kids who were born within the LRA rank. They grew up seeing guns, using guns, hearing gunshots. The question of girls and boys, it has never been the same treatment. As I felt I was so lucky. I was abducted, I was given the gun, I was fighting as a child soldier, while many girls that sadly, at one point, I also participated in abducting and recruiting under the commands of the LRA, where either on arrival at the camps, they were chosen by the commanders to be their wives. And those who are not chosen, those are the lucky one, I would say, who were given guns directly. So if you're chosen to be a wife to LRA commander, that means they will use you as much as they want to use you. Your body is not yours. They own you, they own your body, they own everything about you. They abuse you, they sleep with you wherever and whenever they want to. And after they're done with you, then they give you the training and send you back to be a soldier. That is how worse it is for girls within the LRA rank. I fought beside so many young girls. And there are so many that I was lucky after a short while when I escaped, I came back home. I was reunited, reintegrated through the World Vision rehabilitation program. I was given sensitization training, and I was given a value to life again. I was encouraged to still dream, to still think beyond the negatives that I've done with my life. I was taught that forgiveness is still possible. After all I did, I thought that was the end of it. But then I think every single day of the girls and boys who I left behind, those who didn't have the same opportunity like I did to leave this war, to get out. And this motivated me to start speaking up, because I felt like, this war is not, it has never been beneficial to a lot of people. The media lost interest in it because not so many people want to hear about the war anymore. It's a problem everywhere. There's war in Syria, there's war everywhere. Right now, there's war in Ukraine. People are tired of hearing about war. So people don't even have time for this anymore. And yet this is happening every single day. These children, instead of being given books and pens to go to school, to study, to dream, to change the world, they're given guns. I was given a gun made in Germany, a G3 gun, made in Freiburg, Germany. So I asked myself sometimes, what if this gun was not sent to my country? What if it was not sent to the wrong hands? Was I ever going to be a child soldier? Maybe not. because there would be no gun to use. But at the end of the day, that motivated me to start speaking for the right of children, to start advocating against weapon exports in the wrong hands. Because within weapon exports, which is of course a huge business, it's a huge profit. But without that, we have a way to fight this terror that children goes through. Without the constant exchanges of weapons, we have a way to save children from Ukraine. It is happening now, and we are watching every single day. Children pays the price for the war. I have, as a person, done my part, and I'm still doing my part, that I will speak always and speak, and I hope you listen to the cry of these children. I am just one individual, but there are millions and millions of children who are still every day being tortured, who are still every day being deprived of their rights, who are fighting a war they don't understand. I hope the world will eventually hear their cries, and we come to the realization that we need to build a peaceful environment around them. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Innocent, for that very moving intervention. And indeed, it is impressive how you have transformed your tragic personal experience into becoming an advocate against the child recruitment. And thank you indeed for doing your part and for reminding us that we also have to do ours. So thank you very much for that, Innocent. If I may move to our next speaker, our next speaker is Mr. Eric Hazard. Mr. Hazard is Save the Children's Pan-African Campaign and Policy Director based in Senegal. Mr. Hazard has been coordinating Save the Children's advocacy efforts on the children and armed conflict agenda in that region. More recently, he has focused on the Sahel and is one of the main authors of the policy brief on child recruitment in that region. Mr. Hazard, Save the Children conducted this comprehensive research around the causes of recruitment and use of children by parties to conflict in the Sahel. What can we learn from this evolving phenomenon, and what can we do to address it? Mr. Hazard, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Yes, thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me to this important forum and this important discussion. Always very difficult to speak after somebody like Innocent, who has been living that directly. But I think it's important also to speak for the million of Innocent in the Sahel and beyond Sahel. Today, when you are looking about Sahel, we are speaking about over 2.1 million displaced people between Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. We are also speaking about 2.6 million children in need of humanitarian assistance. All of that as a result of a rapid increasing violence and growing insecurity in this region, which have been led to a worsening security situation, and at the end of the day, in an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Unfortunately, children are again the first victim and the most neglecting person when we are responding to the crisis. And I think this is what we have been trying to look at. What we knew before launching our research was that in the Central Sahel, more and more children are being abducted, killed, and maimed and recruited by armed groups. Looking to the official data in the latest report of the UN Secretary General on children affected by armed conflict in 2020, 1 out of 3 children victims of serious violation were in West and Central Africa. We also knew that in the 3 border region of Niger, armed groups killed more than 60 children in the first 2 quarters of 2021. But beyond the data, for us, it was really important to understand what was a key driver and what was a key motivation driving this growing and worrying phenomenon about this number of children joining and recruiting by half house group. That's why with the Senegalese institute named the GEM, we have been deciding to conduct an in-depth study in 2021. Not only to better understand this trend of recruitment and use affecting children by different parties of the conflict, with a specific focus on the non-state armed group in our research, but so for us to try to collect some qualitative data in order to inform the state, the donors, but also the child rights actor about the growing and in some way new risk for children recruiting in this region. So it was very interesting that when we have been starting doing this research, our main assumption was that children were mainly recruiting by armed force group, was the idea for us is that children were kidnapped, in fact, by this group. And it's clear that when we are looking about the main finding of the research, kidnapping is one of the main form of forced recruitment. And families inside today live in the constant fear of their children being kidnapped. But what was very interesting for us was that the recruitment of children and young people is also today mainly facilitated by economical and social pressure. Sometimes just because of the promise of a motorcycle and a sum around 600 euro is enough to attract some youth. Conscription by the arms group is also perceived as a bridge to integrate the regular army after the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration process. And as mentioned also by some of the youth that we have been interviewing doing this research, joining armed group is sometimes also a response to protect yourself, but also to protect your family. Ultimately, I think one of the key findings was that basically the possibility to get access to a bit of a social recognition in a society where children have not seen any future was also identified sometimes, unfortunately, as a source of motivation for some of them. So overall, this research is telling us that within the 3 countries where we have been doing the research, there is clearly a deliberate and clearly established strategy, mainly by the non-state armed group, strategy to undermine the presence and the representation of the state through the systematic targeting of the services of the state to try to control area, but also to keep basic social services closed. Today, over 5,500 schools are closed because of deliberate target from this armed group. They are also using this non-state armed group. They are also taking advantage, in fact, of the frustration and difficult condition in which a large number of children from this country are currently growing to try to strengthen the basis. So, considering all of that, what can be done? What needs to be done next? I think what is clear is that when we did our research, it has been very difficult to determine the exact number of children associated with armed group or non-state armed group. But there was enough information showing a clear trend, a growing and roaring trend in this region. And it's also clear that these armed groups are taking advantage of the continuing environmental degradation to recruit these vulnerable children who are becoming the first victim of this conflict. But in a region where 1 in 2 people is under 15, we need to make sure that we won't abandon children affected by armed conflict in the Sahel. And how do we do that? So I think there's a few things that we have been trying to explore and that we are trying to share with the government, with the donors community, and so on. The first one is that if the humanitarian situation and the crisis in the Sahel is well known and recognized, we also need to recognize the specific risk children are today facing in the Sahel. This means that we need to integrate the specific protection needs of the children in all the national humanitarian response in this country. We also need to put in place some plan to prevent and stop some future recruitment and use of the children. For children affecting, it's important also to promote the demobilization of the children by recognizing the specific need, but also try to create some psychosocial and economic care center to try to support them, to accompany them, to make sure that they will be able to go through this trauma, but also to get a better future, which has been one of the drivers that has been identified as one of the key problems children are facing today. But we also need to work with all the parties to the conflict to ensure the respect of international obligation related to protection of children against recruitment. And I think it has been mentioned at the beginning by Mrs. Gambas. I think it's important to reinforce monitoring and reporting of such violation. I'm not sure we have this monitoring system in the 3 countries. We have one in Mali. It's also important to always consider children associating with armed actors as a victim. I think this is a key point which still need to be reinforced across the different parties in this region, and we need to work with community to try to strengthen some of the structure within the community, within the family, to address the vulnerability and to prevent recruitment. But to conclude, and as I've been saying at the beginning, I think this crisis affecting children first is also a wider crisis, and we need, within this specific approach, to have also a holistic response An holistic response to ensure that children will be able to get access to basic services tomorrow, including education services, because we know that this is a protective environment they need for boys and girls to be able to continue to have the life and benefit of their livelihood. So that's what I can share with you from now, and I'm happy to share later some more information. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hazard. And indeed, the situation in the Sahel is one that is dramatic, and one that is certainly a focus also of ECHO's attention. But I also highlight in particular the recommendations you make, for example, the integration of specific protection needs in humanitarian plans, psychosocial support, which I think is very key, but also the point you made about education. And as you know, DG ECHO dedicates 10% of its budget to education in emergencies, precisely to provide also this overarching protective environment in such situations. So thank you very much for that. I will now move to our next speaker and give the floor to Ms. Bridget Kennedy-Feister, who is the Senior Child Protection Specialist at UNICEF. Ms. Feister, you are this Child Protection Specialist at UNICEF headquarters, focusing on children and armed conflicts since January 2019. From what I understand, you also previously served as the Chief of Child Protection for UNICEF in Iraq, as a Judicial Affairs Officer for the UN Assistance Mission in Afghanistan. And as a lawyer, you have also represented children and their families in care and protection proceedings and appeals. Ms. Feister, could you tell us what concrete actions government and humanitarian and development actors can take to address recruitment and use of children by armed forces or armed groups? I give you the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Good morning from New York, everyone. It's wonderful to be here, and very much appreciating the comments of the panelists before me. Hopefully I will compliment and not necessarily repeat what they've said, though there is, of course, some overlap. First, I wanted to kind of echo what Mr. Hazard was saying about the need for a holistic approach. Children live within an ecosystem of a family, community, nation, and world. And that context in which they live, those different levels of context really have a major impact on them, on their lives. Not only in their experiences inside armed conflict, as Mr. Oponya has mentioned, but also when we respond to them as humanitarian and development actors. The differences in context can be from a cultural perspective, a political, a conflict dynamic perspective, can also be from a gender perspective, as was mentioned, or from an economic perspective. What are those things that are influencing them? So when practitioners and governments look at the situation of children associated with armed forces or groups, we could start with a number of questions, I think, to orient our programming and our approaches. So for example, why in a particular context? So I think, Eric, you mentioned the Sahel, but also, of course, there's just such a wide range of conflicts happening in the world, and they're very different. Why in a particular context does a child or do children become associated with armed actors? Is it because of that abduction that was described, forcible abduction? Or is it because they simply are living in an area which is completely controlled by an armed group? There really is no meaningful choice. Is it because of the cultural reasons, whereby young men and adolescents, boys, are maybe encouraged to play that protective role that Ms. Gamba was mentioning, perhaps to the detriment of their own futures? Or is it because there's really limited options for support for their families, so that they're sent to work or sent to participate in to join armed actors because it's the only way they can feed themselves, or because they will get some money? So the answers to those questions about why, the why question, really can influence what it is that we do as practitioners. So what is it? What are then the interventions? Because what we're trying to do is to prevent it from happening in the first place, right? This isn't. Of course, we want to respond, and we do respond, and try to support children who are exiting. But in terms of prevention, we want to look at those real reasons, those drivers, those push factors, those pull factors, those things that really put pressure on children and families, and to where there's almost no other option. Um, so for practitioner then, what we are recommending and seeing, and trying to develop tools for, is to build with an evidence base. So a study like what Save the Children has done in Sahel, for example, that gives you those reasons, those reasons why and how children become engaged. It can also, so starting with that situation analysis, that conflict analysis, that gender analysis, all of those are really important when you're developing a program intervention. And recently, we have supported UNICEF with Plan International, has supported development of a program development toolkit, which really does that, tries to provide some tools for practitioners to actually do that analysis and then inform that programming, and then adapt that programming to that context, right? It also, I think Ms. Gamba, you mentioned the need to engage young people. That is a big part of it. What in a particular context, engaging with young people, what did they say about their future? What did they say about what it means to have successful reintegration? This tool has also some tools around how to engage young people to answer those questions. So it's not us dropping in from outside to say this is what you need, right? It's informed by the context and by young people. Similarly, with gender aspects, we need to have a gender analysis to understand what is happening with girls, what can be the response, what can be the prevention mechanisms for them. We also want to look at protective factors. That's another component. What is it that actually helps influences young people to keep from? So not only the negative part of the threats to them, but what is it that's helping protect them? What are those things that really influence them? Is it parents? What can we do to support parents and communities and elders? What can we do to have those peer networks? Peers are very much for adolescents a really influential. So how do we do that? For example, for parents, are they attuned to changes in their children if they're being influenced by an armed group, for example? What could they do in order to interrupt that? So in any case, just to say that enhancing these different aspects that we think is really important to look at those protective components, education, workforce development, and things like that, again, before recruitment happens, or to prevent re-recruitment. And then I just want to say about government actors, we also, it's very clear that governments really need to also understand the why question. um, how come in a particular context children are becoming associated, whether it's with their own state armed forces or armed groups. There are different interventions, and states have some really particular tools at their disposal that are a bit different than humanitarian actors. For example, um, screening mechanisms, right, for armed forces. There are many states that actually don't really have those in place, that really also identify, make that mark, that 18-year-old mark, and say, you know what, no one is coming in, and we are going to do some screening in advance. They can support universal birth registration, because proof of age in and of itself can be a real problem where there's no universal free birth registration. A person can't show that they're a child without some of that documentation, or it makes it much harder. So those types of tools can be super helpful. They also, of course, governments enact laws, enforce laws, implement laws in ways that obviously humanitarian development actors can't do. So it's about accountability. I think Ms. Gamba mentioned that. How do we hold those people accountable? What laws can be in place? And again, it's also about investment in child protection systems, right? Children need to be put into child protection systems, from a response perspective. Again, was mentioned the tendency, particularly in counterterrorism context, to arrest and detain children instead of to transferring them to child protection actors. So handover protocols, really important interventions that states can put in place, standard operating procedures to hand over if military encounters children, to hand them over to child protection actors, but also then investing in those systems, making sure that there are, from a community perspective, people who can support children and their families to be reunified and reintegrated. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for that intervention, and indeed the highlighting the wider context and how it influences everything on the ground, and can also lead to certain factors, and also your call and your plea for more investment in child protection services. So thank you very much for that. So, dear colleagues, I think that wraps up the first segment of this humanitarian talk, and we will now move to the second segment. And I'd like to introduce the interventions from the floor, following which there will be a brief opportunity also for questions and answers to the panelists. But perhaps I will start by giving the floor to Ambassador Delphine Bourrion. Ambassador Bourrion is the Ambassador at Large for Human Rights from the French Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs. Ambassador, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I hope you are listening and looking at me. So if the camera is working. So thank you very much, all the organizers, and thank you for these fascinating interventions. And particular thanks to Innocent Okwonga. I was in the 2007 conference in Paris, and I had the privilege to hear also Ismail Bey relating his own experience. And I think your testimony are so key to make us realize the seriousness of the situation and how we can better also counteract it. Let me first also express my deep concern about the human rights and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine to start this intervention, because it sadly recalls us of the relevance of today's discussion. The Russian armed forces launched unlawful and atrocious attacks on civilian facilities, including schools, orphanages, and hospitals. And in face of these blatant violations of international law, France, of course, is committed to working together with all the UN institutions and other relevant agencies to integrate a child-sensitive and gender-responsive approach in all our efforts to respond to the conflict in Ukraine. And we need to do that in the immediate humanitarian response, the crisis response, but also in the longer-term peace and security efforts. And indeed, as it was mentioned, we have credible reports that thousands of children in the Donbass and Crimea are subject to military training and other military-related activities. These remind us that preventing recruitment in armed forces, releasing children enlisted into armed groups, sanction against people having unlawfully recruited children, and reintegrating child soldiers into civilian life must remain a priority, as we committed in the Paris commitments 15 years ago, and that Russia itself committed to. Besides, Ukraine's serious violations persist in other parts of the world: Afghanistan, Syria, the Sahel, as Eric Hazard also mentioned. We are also witnessing an increase in attacks of education, sexual violence, denial of humanitarian access. We also observe a differentiated impact on girls, and the COVID-19 pandemic has also increased this phenomena. We therefore must continue our mobilization to concrete action in that regard, and we welcome the launch of the toolkit prepared by UNICEF and Plan International. Of course, there are not only bad news. We have also seen, through the constant engagement of all the actors, more than 170,000 children released in recent years, and we should be proud of. And on the 5th of February, we have celebrated the 15th anniversary of the Paris Principle and Commitment, and adopted during this Free Children from War conference organized by France and UNICEF. Now there are 112 states who have endorsed it. But it's not only to endorse, to ratify, we have to implement, you have to respect all these commitments, and that we are also calling to all countries to do. We reaffirm our strong support to the work of Mrs. Virginia Gamba, a special representative for children in armed conflict, and to the work of UNICEF. France is also playing a leading role in the adoption of the UN Security Council resolutions 1539 and 1612, which established a mechanism for monitoring and reporting on grave violations committed against children in armed conflict. Through this mechanism, the UN Secretary General issues an annual report in which he lists the parties to the armed conflicts responsible for grave violations against children, being armed group or regular forces. And we, of course, know impunity has to cease, and it is through this assessment of these violations that we can help these commitments to be respected. Be assured that France will continue to do its part to address all these challenges in the Security Council, in all international fora, and on the ground. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we could not see you, at least I couldn't see you, but certainly your words came across loud and clear. And thank you for reminding us of the dramatic situation, not only in Ukraine, but further afield in many other countries, for reminding us also of the successes, but also for reiterating the support of France to Ms. Gamba's office, and on the need to stress the importance of implementation, so turning our words into action. So thank you very much, Ambassador. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Pinielli Lorenzo, who is the first secretary at the Permanent Representation of Italy to the EU. Mr. Pinielli, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a diplomat. I'm working at the Italian Permanent Representation, as you said, and I am the COAFR delegate. So I'm the diplomat working for Italy at the Africa Working Group of the Council. So first of all, let me thank the organizer for the invitation and allowing me, and thank you for allowing me to listen and intervening to this interesting discussion. Let me first stress that Italy strongly supports the mandate of the UN Special Representative for Children and the armed conflicts. We consider her effort to raise awareness on this topic of the utmost importance. The same appreciation obviously goes to the organization like UNICEF, NGOs like Save the Children, and I also would like to join the other in thanking Mr. Opuonia for sharing his very touching personal experience. So Italy supports the initiatives taken on this topic in all the relevant working multilateral fora, including, for instance, the recent Security Council resolution on protection of education in conflict. As it was also highlighted by the UN Special Representative, the aspect of education is paramount. We are talking about a right that has been particularly under stress during the pandemic, with the risk to have long-term consequences. Indeed, school closures continue to have a detrimental effect on millions of children worldwide, increasing the risk of abuses and recruitment into armed groups. But the protection of school is at least even more important, and the figures in that regard are extremely unsettling, as it was also highlighted by Save the Children. So as Italian member of COAFR, my focus is mainly on Africa, and I can assure you that with my colleagues, we follow the aspect of children and the armed conflict with the utmost attention. In many countries affected by instability in Africa, from the Sahel region to the Horn of Africa and the Great Lakes region. So what I can say is that the importance of addressing protection of children in the armed conflict is clearly stated in the most recent EU strategy for the Horn of Africa and the Sahel region. It was an issue that we as Italy raised during the negotiation of the Council conclusions, together with other like-minded member states. And so we are glad to say that it is now among the main strategic priorities for the EU in Sahel and in the Horn of Africa. The key words are prevention of conflicts and of abuses against children, and working hard on their reintegration in the society, which is paramount. But where the EU can really make the difference, and it was already said by my previous speaker, but the answer for us is employing is putting in place a real and comprehensive integrated approach, only putting together with an holistic view, as it was said, humanitarian assistance, stabilization efforts, and development cooperation, the EU can really provide a real added value. As for Sahel, for instance, the return of the reestablishment of the state in the vulnerable areas and the strengthening of their capacity to deliver basic services such as education, health, police, water and electricity is paramount to take the root causes of the instability and the best way to prevent abuses on children. So it is, of course, a long and difficult path, but is the only long-term solution, and it is where exactly the Team Europe can have a higher and more effective impact. Thank you very much for your attention. Over.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pinielli, and indeed, thank you for highlighting again the issue of safe schools and the dramatic situation in the Sahel and in the Horn. And indeed, thank you for the support of Italy in ensuring that these issues are well reflected in the Council conclusions, and note taken also of your plea for a more Team Europe approach. Thank you very much for that. Perhaps I can give the floor now to Mr. Victor Vermier, who is the attaché at the Permanent Representation of Belgium to the EU. Mr. Vermier, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
See me? Yes, you should be able to see me now. Good afternoon, distinguished panelists, and thank you to Joanna for the kind introduction. I also would like to reiterate Belgium's full commitment to protect children's rights and to end and prevent grave violations. In our bilateral relations, we consistently also insist on the ratification of the operational protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. And also at the European level, we try to push forward the children conflict agenda. And in this regard, Belgium, together with the Netherlands and Luxembourg, recently presented a non-paper to the EU's Political and Security Committee, with concrete proposals to further mainstream children and armed conflict throughout our EU's integrated approach to conflicts and crisis, and also to work closely with the UN system in this regard. The non-paper was supported by a large group of member states, and this sends a clear signal of commitment from the EU side, and we will look forward to implement it. Many of the proposals in this non-paper were actually mirroring some ideas, some proposals that Ms. Gamba made in her intervention. Then prevention should be central in our approach, as the impact of grave violations is long-standing and affects future generations. And securing access to safe and qualitative education here is key, as mentioned also by other interveners. One of the findings of the Save the Children report indeed shows that long-term school closures are jeopardizing the futures of a whole generation at individual, community, but also at societal level. And this is very worrying. And the situation in the Sahel clearly shows that. I'll I was also going to mention the Sahel strategy, where children armed conflict is a specific attention point, and but my Italian colleague has done that very well. So I'll join his words, and I'll finish my intervention with a word of thanks for putting this thematic on the agenda of the EU Humanitarian Forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor, and also thank you for highlighting your initiative in the PSC on children and armed conflict. Definitely helps to keep this issue high on the agenda. That concludes the interventions from the floor, but perhaps it would be a good moment now to perhaps have the reactions of the panelists to the interventions of the member states, and also any key concluding comments that you may have on this discussion. May I give the floor to you, Ms. Gamba?
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with everything I've heard today. And I particularly want to reaffirm what the UNICEF and Save the Children have said. I would like to stress one item. We need to do much more to provide resources. That's just not money. It's also posts for child protection experts. It is impossible to do monitoring, reporting, engaging with parties, prevention, protection, observation, and reintegration, and release assistance without the expertise of child protection officers. It has been 10 years where we're losing the capacity in the field for budget cuts. This has got to stop. We need to not just retain what little child protection capacity we have, even if it's nothing more than to monitor. You know that under the Security Council, we have to monitor according to MRN standards, which are very specific. And we cannot do that without the people that know how to do that on the ground. So even if it's for that, we need to redouble the post, the idea of resourcing child protection as a serious issue to move forward on the ground and to prevent recruitment and use. I think the only other item I would like to say is that we need, and I reaffirm what UNICEF said, we need a holistic approach. We need to break the cycle of violence. It has to conform to the entirety of the nexus that we have mentioned. And lastly, a warning, a very big warning. There are some armed groups that will never talk to anybody about engaging because they use the recruitment and use of children as part of their lifeline. It is their bloodline. They have to keep it, if not they die. And these groups are extremist groups such as Boko Haram, ISIL, Daesh, Al-Shabaab. And we have to be aware of this. We also have to be aware that in many of these groups, there is a false pretense that recruitment and use is not happening because there is a non-definition of what the age of a child is. We need to defend that the definition of a child is up to 18, like the CRC says. If anybody else starts to mess around with that and say that the child is only up to puberty, then we're dead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Gamba. Innocent, would you like to share with us your reflections?
Yeah, thank you so much for welcoming me back again. First, I would like to say, when we talk about child protection, like Ms. Gamba said, children, according to the United Nations, is any human below the age of 18. And this should not just apply to poor nations only, it should also apply to the Western nations. But then the Western nations, of course, I'm not going to mention any country, they are still recruiting 17 years old, 16 years old in their military system. So are we playing a double standard, or are we playing the game of a mouse and a cat? The same thing applies when we talk about peaceful solutions. And I've heard some politicians talk about this just today, right now. You know, we are trying to do this, we are trying to do that, we are trying to do this. But for how long? This is the same speech we had 10 years ago, 20 years ago about Congo. But then there's too much interest in a country like Congo, whereby the interest of profit outweighs the need to protect the child. When we talk about peaceful solutions and the other hand, we are sending weapons, Are we fooling the people that we are trying to protect, or are we fooling ourselves? Because peace and weapons, they don't go together. The same country coming to mediate is sending weapons from the back door to the same conflicting parties. I find this really playing with the victims. And I find this so disrespectful to people who did not choose to fight these wars, and they're fighting them. I find this an insult from these nations who are sending these weapons. I, for once, in a sermon with World Vision from Berlin, I asked this one question: that what if we spend this amount of money that we are giving in military aids to these countries? What if we buy flowers and send these children? Don't we think we will make these children more happy? Don't we think then there might be a little gleam of happiness in the eyes of these children? Don't we see a path of happiness, of laughter, of a future where a child grows while knowing their children, other than starting to be an adult at the age of 10? So my humble request to every politician who is listening, to every advocate who is here, let's mean what we say. Let's walk the talk. We talk, and we've been talking, but the action has been not matching the capacity of the talks. We have not been matching our words with actions. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me to share my story with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Innocent. Perhaps I hand over quickly to Eric for some reflections.
Yes, I think I will make a reflection around 3 quick points to allow others to speak. The first one is that, as said, we need to have an holistic approach to address this issue. I've been spoken about saying, on top of the million of children which were out of school for years, we have now 1 million children out of schools because of the school which have been targeted and closed because of insecurity. So you understand that without integrating an holistic approach, we won't succeed. The second point is that this holistic approach needs to be supported by a recognition of the specific threats and the specific needs of the children. This recognition needs to be political and need to be financial. In many of the countries, when we are presenting our study to the authority, in some ways they are discovering the magnitude of the problem. Nobody was thinking that there was a so big problem in the region. And today, when you are looking about the humanitarian response plan in the Sahel region, in countries like Burkina, only 5% of the resources are dedicated to protection, not child protection, protection as a whole. So we won't be able to address this issue if we are not investing in line with the resource. But this needs to have a political recognition to make sure that it's becoming a political priority. And the last point is that we need to make sure that we're going to address the counter-terrorism law, which is really undermining our capacity to act on the ground. Today, we need to make a distinction about speaking and discussing with the actor of the conflict versus the political recognition of the actor of the conflict. We are independent, we are impartial, we are equidistant, and we're going to remain like this. That's our humanitarian principle. But we need to be allowed to discuss with these people, even if it doesn't mean that we are recognizing them from a political point of view. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Eric. Bridget, I hand over to you for final reflections.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the panelists, and to you, Joanna, for facilitating. Just to say one thing, I think, or perhaps two. Number one, I did hear from some of, I think it was France and others, about turning, as much as we're thrilled by 112 states that have endorsed the Paris Principles, we need to implement, right? So we must turn to action. I think this reflects what Innocent was saying. We must turn to real action. And I wanted to mention in relation to this, and this is somehow reflective of Ms. Gamba's last point regarding the Convention on the Rights of the Child, other humanitarian and human rights law. These normative standards are only as powerful as we all as an international community support. So anywhere and everywhere that they are undermined, it has an impact across the board for children everywhere. So I was thinking about, as I was listening, the ability of member states also to influence each other, to hold each other to those standards, to collectively move forward for action, but also to support and not just when it's expedient, because sometimes, you know, in one place we might criticize one state might criticize another, but in another they might not want to because of another interest. We need to have some consistent, principled, you know, support of these normative frameworks collectively. It's really, if you as I said, if you undermine it in one place, it has an impact in another. So I just wanted to call on states to really, really stand by the CRC, the Children Armed Conflict agenda in a meaningful way, and not merely sort of for expediencies. These are children we're talking about. Each one of these 100,000 children is an individual story, like we've heard from Innocent, an individual child, an individual family. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bridget, for those reflections. This brings us to the end of our exchange. I'd like to thank all the panelists and also the additional interventions from the floor. I think today has been a very rich discussion, both in terms of showing us the scale of the problem, but also it was very instructive because we also have a couple of solutions. We have a couple of paths to follow, whether it's the issue that Ms. Gamba highlighted, that we need to ensure child protection officers, the capacity which in the field is going down but needs to go up, the issue of a holistic approach. I think these are all issues on which we as policymakers have to continue to focus on and make clear inroads. So I thank you very much for your attention, and thank you also to those who have logged on. And again, thank you to the co-organizers for taking this initiative. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.